The rain had been falling for hours when the knock came, three sharp strikes against a door that had heard too many bad nights. The kind of knock that didn't ask permission. Daniel Brooks heard it from the other end of the apartment, where he had just finished tucking Lily into the narrow bed beneath the window. She had finally stopped asking questions and closed her eyes, and he had allowed himself one full breath of relief before the sound interrupted everything. He crossed the small living room in 4 steps, stepping over a coloring book and a pair of small sneakers that hadn't been put away. The apartment was clean in the way that people who have very little keep things clean deliberately, almost stubbornly. The walls were old, the carpet worn to its threads in the high-traffic corners, and a water stain on the ceiling had been spreading slowly since October. But the dishes were done, the laundry folded, and the one framed photograph of a woman smiling in a hospital gown was dusted and centered on the shelf. Daniel was 36 years old, and had the face of someone who had been handsome once, and was still handsome, but in a way that required you to look carefully, because the years had layered other things over it. Tiredness, patience, something that might have been sorrow if it hadn't settled into something quieter and more permanent. He did the kind of work that kept him invisible. Deliveries, odd jobs, a few days a week at a hardware store, where nobody learned the staff's names. He was good at being invisible. He had been practicing since the day he understood that invisibility was one of the things that kept Lily fed and safe in a world that had no particular reason to be kind to either of them. He reached the door and opened it without checking the peephole. Because in this building, bad news always knocked directly. What stood on the other side stopped him cold. She was dressed in black, a tailored suit that had no business being anywhere near this block, near this building, near the smell of mildew and cigarette smoke that drifted up from the hallway. Her heels were the kind that cost more than a month of Daniel's rent. Her hair was pulled back, not a strand out of place. And her face was the face of someone who had long ago decided that expressions were inefficient. She was young, not as young as the tabloids made her look, but younger than the weight behind her eyes suggested. Victoria Hale. Even Daniel, who hadn't followed business news in years, knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. The daughter, the new head of Hale Industries, the one the financial press called ruthless, and the gossip columns called cold, and the people who worked under her called neither because they valued their jobs. She had taken control of the company 6 weeks after her father's funeral, and had not taken a day off since, because stillness was dangerous, and work was a form of control, and control was the only grief she knew how to practice. She had spent those 6 weeks going through every document her father had left behind, and most of them had made sense to her balance sheets, partnership agreements, legal filings, all the paper infrastructure of a company she had been studying since she was old enough to sit in the boardroom without fidgeting. And then she had found the locked drawer, and the file with Daniel Brooks's name on it, and a number that had never been closed, and she had put on her coat and gotten into her car and come here, to this building, in this rain, because she was Victoria Hale, and Victoria Hale settled accounts. She was holding a manila envelope. Her eyes moved over Daniel the way a person reads a contract quickly, thoroughly, looking for the clause that causes problems. She found whatever she was looking for and held out the envelope. Her voice, when she spoke, was exactly what he would have expected, precise, unhurried, stripped of warmth. "You're Daniel Brooks." It wasn't a question. "I'm Victoria Hale." That wasn't a question either. "My father passed away 6 weeks ago. In going through his estate, I found a record of a financial arrangement between him and you, dating back approximately 10 years. She paused, and in that pause, the rain fell harder against the window at the end of the hall. The arrangement was never closed. The debt was never settled. She tapped the envelope. "I'm here to collect." Daniel didn't move. He stood in the doorway the way a man stands when the ground has shifted, and he hasn't decided yet whether to fall. He looked at the envelope, and then back at her face, and then at the rain past her shoulder. And something old and painful crossed his expression before he controlled it. He took the envelope. He opened it slowly. The document inside was a decade old, the paper soft at the folds, the ink slightly faded, but the number clear, and the signature at the bottom, unmistakably that of Edward Hale. Daniel read it once. Then he looked up at Victoria and said, very quietly, "Your father told me this would never come back. He looked me in the eye, and he said that." Victoria's expression didn't flicker. "My father," she said a great many things. "I'm here about what he signed." Daniel held the paper for a long moment. Then, from behind him, small feet padded across the floor, and a voice high, sleepy, curious, asked the question that changed everything. "Daddy, is that the lady from the old picture?" He had met Edward Hale on a Tuesday in November, the year the city had its worst ice storm in 2 decades. Daniel had been 26 years old, and grateful for every shift he could get. He had been working for a car service that held the Hale Industries account for nearly 3 years. And in that time, he had driven Edward Hale perhaps a dozen times, always early mornings, always the same route, always with the same classical music playing low on the radio, because the old man liked it, and Daniel had learned to have it ready. Edward Hale was not what Daniel had expected from a billionaire. He was quiet. He read physical books in the back seat. He tipped generously and thanked drivers by name. On the night the ice storm hit, Daniel had been driving Edward home from a dinner that had run later than scheduled. The roads were black glass. Daniel had seen the other car sliding before anyone else did, the oncoming headlights going sideways across the lane, in a way that could only end one way. He had made the decision in less than a second. He pulled the wheel hard, sacrificed the rear of the vehicle against a concrete divider, and absorbed the impact that would otherwise have come directly into the passenger door. Edward Hale walked away without a scratch. The other driver had been drunk, a fact that emerged slowly and then, even more slowly, was buried. What followed was not a reward. It was a reckoning. The accident report became a source of corporate liability. Someone had to carry the damage, and the easiest person to carry it was the driver. Statements were adjusted. Details were rearranged. Daniel found himself described as having made an error in judgment on icy roads. He lost the account. He lost the job. And 6 weeks after the accident, an attorney appeared at his door with a check and a short letter, and the implicit message that the matter was now settled. The check was not a fortune. It was enough barely to cover the medical bills that had been building since his wife, Renata, had been diagnosed 3 months earlier. He had refused it at first. He had said he didn't want money, that he had done what anyone would have done, that he only wanted the truth recorded correctly. But Renata was in the hospital, and the bills were real. And eventually, Daniel took the check because love makes pragmatists of idealists, and he loved his wife more than he loved being right. Renata died 14 months later. She never knew about the money or the silence. She only knew that Daniel had come home one evening and held her hand for a very long time without saying anything, and she had let him, because she understood that some things were too heavy to be put into words. Victoria, standing in the doorway of that worn apartment, knew none of this. She knew the number on the document. She knew that money had exchanged hands and that the matter had never been formally discharged. She had spent the weeks since her father's funeral going through every file, every account, every record she could find, because grief in people like Victoria Hale does not express itself as weeping. It expresses itself as control. She had found the Daniel Brooks file in a locked drawer in her father's private office, and she had read it the way she read every document, for facts, for exposure, for what it might cost her. She had not read it for the story underneath, because she had not yet learned that every number has a story underneath, and sometimes the story is the only thing that matters. Lily was 8 years old and had her father's eyes and her mother's way of walking into rooms as if she had been expected. She stood in the doorway between the bedroom and the living room in her pajamas, holding a photograph in both hands, the way children hold things they know are precious. She looked at Victoria the way children look at people who are beautiful and frightening in equal measure, with open, uncalibrated curiosity. The photograph was the size of a playing card, slightly creased at one corner, and it showed a younger version of the woman in the doorway, standing next to a silver-haired man who was smiling down at her with the complete helplessness of a father who has run out of ways to refuse his daughter anything. Victoria stared at the photograph for 3 full seconds. Her face did something unexpected. Not much, just a small, involuntary softening at the corners of her eyes, the kind that happens when a person sees something they thought was gone, and finds that the sight of it still has force. "Where did you get that?" she asked. Lily looked at her father for permission, and then back at the woman. "Grandpa Edward gave it to me," she said. "He said you were really pretty when you were little. He said you were still really pretty, but you forgot how to smile." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Victoria turned to Daniel slowly, and for the first time since she had arrived, her certainty looked less certain. Victoria looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his daughter. The photograph sat between them like a small, irrefutable argument. And the rain on the windows provided the only sound for several seconds. Lily had not moved. She was still holding the photograph with both hands, still watching Victoria with that open, patient attention that children deploy when they are waiting for the adult world to catch up with something they have already understood. Victoria said, slowly, "My father never told me he visited anyone here," Lily said, with perfect confidence. "He came lots of times. He taught me how to make paper boats. He said you used to make them when you were little." Victoria opened her mouth and closed it again. She had made paper boats when she was small at the kitchen table of a house she had grown up in, before the money grew too large and the houses grew too formal, and the kitchen became a room the chef used. She had not thought about paper boats in 20 years. She had not thought there was anyone left alive who would know to mention them. After Renata died, Edward Hale had appeared at the apartment unannounced, not with attorneys, not with documents, alone, in a coat that was too expensive for the neighborhood, carrying a paper bag from a grocery store 2 blocks away. Daniel had almost not opened the door. But Lily had been 3 years old and crying, and he had been running on no sleep and bad instant coffee. And sometimes the body makes decisions the mind hasn't authorized yet. Edward had not stayed long that first time. He had set the groceries on the counter, looked at Lily for a long moment with an expression Daniel could not fully interpret, and said he was sorry, not in the way of a man making a legal disclaimer, but in the way of a man who means it and knows it is insufficient and says it anyway. He came back the following month, and the month after that, he never called ahead. He always brought food, nothing extravagant, just the things a household with a small child goes through quickly. He would sit at the kitchen table and drink whatever Daniel offered him, and watch Lily draw or build things with blocks, or narrate elaborate stories to her stuffed animals with absolute seriousness, and he would look like a man who has found something he didn't know he was looking for. He never spoke about the accident, or the money, or the document in the locked drawer. And Daniel never asked him to. There are arrangements between people that exist entirely outside of language. And this was one of them. Victoria listened to all of this without speaking. When Daniel finished, she was looking at the photograph that Lily was still holding, and her jaw was tight in the way of a person who is holding something large and complicated behind their teeth. Lily, who had the instincts of a child raised on honesty, looked up at the woman and asked with perfect, terrible simplicity, "If Grandpa Edward loved us, why do you want to take our house?" Victoria did not answer. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and removed a letter folded, aged, sealed with tape that had long since dried to brittleness. She had found it in the same locked drawer as the document. She had been carrying it for 3 days without opening it, because some part of her had already understood that opening it would require her to revise something she had built her grief upon. She held it for a moment longer. Then she unfolded it and read. Her father had written the letter 2 years before he died, in the careful, unhurried cursive of a man who has thought about something for a long time before putting it to paper. He wrote that the accident had not been Daniel's fault. He wrote that the error had belonged to a senior director named Warren Cole, who had been in the vehicle that crossed the lane drunk, and driving his own car rather than the company car he should have been using, which was why the initial report had been so carefully managed. He wrote that Warren had been valuable to the company at the time, and that certain decisions had been made to protect certain interests, and that he was not proud of those decisions. He wrote that Daniel Brooks had saved his life and had been repaid with a lie and a check, and that he had tried to address this imperfectly and too late, and in the only ways available to him once the original wrong had already been done. He wrote that he had loved the child Lily with the confused tenderness of a man who understands he has incurred a debt that cannot be settled financially. And he wrote, at the end, that if Victoria was reading this letter, it meant he had run out of time to tell her himself, and that he was sorry for that most of all. Victoria read the letter twice. Then she folded it precisely along its original creases and held it against her chest with both hands, and the rain continued outside, and Daniel said nothing. Because there was nothing to say, and because some silences are not emptiness, but the fullest kind of presence. "I've been running the wrong calculation," she said, finally, to no one in particular. She looked at Daniel with something that was not quite an apology and not quite grief, but carried elements of both. "I thought you were someone who took advantage of a kind man," Daniel said. "I know. I came here to take your house. I know that too." He looked at her steadily, not with anger, not with the cold satisfaction of a man who has been proven right after a long wait, but with the simple tiredness of someone who has been carrying a story alone for a decade and finds, unexpectedly, that it is now being shared. "I never wanted anything from your family," he said. "Not the money. I took the money because I had no other choice, but I never wanted it. And I never wanted to be owed anything. I just wanted my wife to have more time." Victoria looked down at Lily, who had fallen asleep against Daniel's arm in the way that children fall asleep in the middle of dramas they have partially initiated completely, without warning, as if the world is a very comfortable place. The laughter that came out of Victoria was small and involuntary, and surprised her more than it surprised Daniel. It was not a sound she made often. It was not a sound she was sure she still knew how to make. The story broke on a Friday. Someone had leaked documents, fragments of the original accident report, partial financial records, enough to build a narrative that was accurate in its facts and damaging in its framing. The headline that ran across the financial press read, "Hale Industries CO concealed decayed, old cover. Up sources say, executive misconduct, buried by late founder." Victoria saw it on her phone at 6:47 in the morning, while standing in her apartment on the 32nd floor, and she read it 3 times with the stillness of a person calculating the distance between where they are and where they need to be. By 8 o'clock, her board had called an emergency session. By 10, 3 major institutional shareholders had made their positions clear. The stock dropped 11% before lunch. The calls from the communications team came in clusters: what to say, what not to say, whether to issue a statement, whether to stay silent, whether to request an injunction on the documents, whose authenticity everyone already understood to be genuine. Warren Cole, who had been comfortable and quiet for 10 years in his senior advisory role, had apparently decided that the best defense was an aggressive offense, and the documents had his fingerprints all over the timing of their release. By evening, Victoria had been in meetings for 9 consecutive hours and had eaten nothing, and had given no indication of this to anyone. She had sat at the head of the table in the boardroom where her father's portrait hung on the east wall, and had answered questions with the precision of someone who has decided to stop pretending that precision is the same as truth. She had said, "The leak originated from within the company." She had said, "The misconduct described in the documents was real and predated her tenure." She had said, "She intended to address it fully and transparently, and she needed 72 hours. The board had given her 48. She left the building at 9 in the evening and got into her car and sat there without telling the driver where to go, because for the first time in as long as she could remember, she did not have a destination that made sense. The car idled at the curb. The city moved around it. Victoria stared at the windshield and thought about the letter in her jacket pocket, which she had been carrying every day since the night she had read it in Daniel's apartment, and about Lily asleep against her father's arm, and about the sound of her own laugh in a room she would normally never have entered. She told the driver an address on the other side of the city. He did not ask why, because it was not his place to ask, and because the address was unfamiliar, and because sometimes people go places they cannot explain yet. Daniel answered the door in a gray sweatshirt. and the expression of a man who has learned not to be surprised by things that should surprise him. He looked at her for a moment, and then he stepped aside. The apartment was warm. Something had been cooked recently, something with garlic, and something sweet underneath it. Lily was still up, which she absolutely should not have been at that hour. Sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor with a bowl of cereal, she was eating with focused concentration, as if this were normal. She looked up when Victoria came in, processed the information, and said, without excessive drama, "I thought you might come back." She offered Victoria the chair across from her. Victoria sat down in a chair in a kitchen that was smaller than her bathroom, and accepted a bowl of cereal from an 8-year-old who poured it without being asked, and ate it, and did not think about the 48-hour deadline, or the board, or the stock price, or the 11 missed calls on her phone. Daniel sat across from her and said very little, because the kind of company that helps is not always the talking kind. After a while, Lily leaned against Victoria's arm, the way she had leaned against her father's arm the other night, with the uncomplicated trust of a child who has not yet learned to be strategic about who she gives that to, and fell asleep again. Victoria looked down at her. Something in the architecture of her face changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way she could have named, or that a boardroom would have noticed. But changed. The photograph appeared online before midnight. A photographer from a tabloid outlet, who had been loosely following Victoria's movements since the story broke, had gotten the shot through the kitchen window. The CEO of Hale Industries, sitting at a kitchen table in a low-income apartment, eating cereal with a small child. In a building that had peeling paint on the exterior walls, and a buzzer that only worked on alternating Wednesdays, the image was technically mediocre and compositionally extraordinary. It ran under the headline, "Where is Victoria Hale?" and the comments, which ran into the thousands within hours, were divided almost exactly in half-half, finding it damning. Evidence that she had lost her grip. Evidence of a woman in freefall, half finding it something else entirely, something they did not immediately have words for, something about a person they had categorized, sitting in a place that did not fit the category. And looking, for one unguarded second, like she might be all right. The board members who called the following morning were not calling about the photograph, officially. They were calling about the 48 hours, about Warren, about the documents, about strategy. But every call referenced the photograph eventually. The way people reference the thing they are actually thinking about while discussing the thing they have been assigned to discuss. One board member, a woman in her 60s who had known Edward Hale for 30 years, said something that none of the others said. "You look human in that picture, Victoria. That's either the worst thing that could have happened to you this week, or it might be the best." Victoria did not respond to the sentiment. She ended the call and stood at her apartment window looking at the city below, which was enormous and indifferent, and full of people eating cereal at kitchen tables in apartments that cost very different amounts of money and contained, all of them, the same mixture of hope and exhaustion and private grief. Daniel had called that morning, before most of the board calls. He had said carefully that he had seen the photograph. He had said that he was sorry if the publicity was making things harder. He had offered, in the measured tone of a man who is offering something he believes is probably right, even though he knows it will sting. "Maybe it's better if you keep your distance from here, at least until things settle. I don't want to make this worse for you." Victoria had gripped her phone and said, "I don't need you to manage the optics of my life." Her voice had come out sharper than she intended. There was a short silence. Then Daniel said, "That's not what I meant," and she knew it wasn't. Which was why the sharpness had come out at all, because kindness, from unexpected directions, has a way of hitting the places you didn't know were undefended, and the best defense against that is sometimes to push it away before it can reach you all the way. She ended the call. She stood in her apartment and looked at the city. Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the couch, not at the desk, not in the chair, on the floor, and let herself cry for the first time since the funeral. Not about the stock price, not about Warren, about her father and the locked drawer, and the letter and the 10 years of hatred aimed in the wrong direction, and about a little girl who had called Edward Hale grandpa in a cramped apartment bedroom while the rain fell outside, and about the photograph of a young Victoria smiling next to a man who was smiling back with everything he had. Warren Cole appeared in person on a Tuesday. He did not call ahead. He arrived at Hale Industries with 2 attorneys and a very specific kind of calm, the kind that belongs to people who believe they have already won and are only now completing the formality of demonstrating it. He was 63 years old and had the bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades learning which rooms to walk into and how to walk into them. He had spent 10 years telling himself that what he had done was management, not wrongdoing, that the decision to protect the company had been the right decision, and that the driver and the accident and the money had all been unfortunate circumstances handled in the most efficient way available. He had told himself this so many times, and with such conviction that he had largely come to believe it, which is how certain kinds of people survive certain kinds of lives. He requested a meeting with Victoria that was not a request. He sat across from her in the boardroom where her father's portrait hung, and told her, with considerable precision, that the documents that had leaked were a small portion of what he held. He told her that he had been, for the past decade, quietly managing a set of financial arrangements within Hale Industries that had significantly benefited the company's liquidity during several critical periods, and that the details of those arrangements, if they became public, would not merely damage the company's stock price, they would end it. He used the word arrangements. He used it several times. He was careful not to use any of the more accurate words. He told Victoria that the best outcome for everyone, for her, for the company, for the shareholders, for the legacy of Edward Hale, was that she resign quietly, name him as interim chair, and allow the transition to proceed in a way that preserved institutional continuity. He used the phrase institutional continuity as though it were a favor he was offering. Victoria listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Are you done?" Warren said he believed he had covered the essential points. Victoria said, "Then get out of my boardroom." 2 nights later, someone threw a rock through the front window of Daniel's apartment. The sound brought him out of bed in seconds, and he had Lily in his arms and behind the bedroom door before the glass had finished settling. The rock had been wrapped in paper. The paper said, in printed letters, "Stay out of it." Daniel stood in the living room in his bare feet, with glass on the floor around him, and his daughter's heartbeat against his chest, and a cold wind coming through the broken window, and he looked at the note for a long time. Lily was not hurt. He was not hurt. The apartment was cold, and the glass would need to be dealt with, and the note was, in its own way, a form of information. Someone believed that Daniel's proximity to Victoria mattered enough to be addressed. He called her. She answered on the second ring. And when he told her what had happened, the silence on her end was not the cold silence of the person he had met at his door in the rain. It was the silence of someone arriving at a decision. "I'll handle this," she said. Daniel said, "I know you will. That's not why I called." Another silence. Shorter. "Why did you call?" he said. "Because I wanted to hear your voice and make sure you were all right." The silence after that was a different kind, entirely. The files her father had prepared were in a safety deposit box in a bank on the east side of the city, the key to which had been mailed to Victoria's personal address 2 weeks after the funeral by a law firm she did not recognize, with a note that said only, "When you need it." She had put the key in a drawer and not thought about it further, because grief is not linear, and neither is the process of understanding what a person left behind. She retrieved the box on a Thursday morning, alone, without attorneys, without staff. What was inside was thorough. Edward Hale had been, among his other qualities, a methodical man. The documents covered 10 years of Warren Cole's financial misconduct, diverted funds, false reporting, shell accounts, payments to individuals who did not exist. They covered the original accident report and the true sequence of events. They covered the payments made to Daniel, and the context for them, and the reason Edward had never come forward publicly, because going public would have required disclosing his own failures of oversight. And he had not, in his lifetime, found a way to accept that cost. He had, Instead, prepared everything, and waited, and perhaps hoped that the need for it would not arrive. Or perhaps he had known it would, and had decided that what he could not do in life, he could at least make possible for someone else to do after. Victoria spent 2 evenings going through every page. She organized them. She built a presentation that was clean and specific, and left nothing to interpretation. She called Daniel on the second evening, and told him what she had found, and he listened without saying much, and at the end he said, "Your father was trying to do the right thing. He just ran out of time." Victoria said, "He had 10 years. Daniel said, "Sometimes the right thing takes exactly as long as it takes, and not 1 day less." She didn't respond immediately. Then she said, "I need you there. At the press conference, I need someone who knows the whole truth to be standing in the room when I tell it." He said he would be there. The press conference was held on a Friday in the Hale Industries Auditorium, the same room where Edward Hale had announced his daughter's ascension to the CEO role 2 years earlier, in front of the same curved wall of windows, overlooking the same city, which looked different now because Victoria was looking at it differently. She had dressed carefully. She had prepared every word. She stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled reporters and cameras and board members and company staff and said, "My name is Victoria Hale, and I would like to tell you the truth about several things." She told them about the accident. She told them about Warren Cole. She told them about Daniel Brooks and what had actually happened, and what the money had been for, and what her father had actually believed about the man he had paid to be silent. She was precise. She was unapologetic. She was not performing composure. She simply had it. Warren's attorneys moved to interrupt twice. Both times, Victoria continued speaking. She had spent 2 nights rehearsing not the words but the stillness, learning to hold the truth in her voice without letting it become a performance, because the people in that room had seen too many performances, and she was not here to give them another one. She was here to close something that should have been closed 10 years ago, and she intended to close it all the way. Then Daniel walked to the microphone, and the room recalibrated, because he was clearly not from the world that typically stood at microphones in rooms like this, and his presence was the kind that changes the acoustic quality of a space without any deliberate effort. He said, "10 years ago, I took money. I didn't want to care for my wife, who was dying. I've regretted how it happened every day since. Not because I was wrong to keep her alive as long as I could, I would do it again, every time, but because I let someone pay me to be quiet. And quiet has a cost." He looked out at the room with the steady gaze of someone who has nothing left to protect. "Mr. Cole has spent the last several weeks suggesting that the story of that money makes me look bad. He might be right. But it also tells you exactly who he is and what he's been doing in this company for 10 years. And I think that story is considerably more interesting." The laughter that ran through the room was brief and real. Warren Cole stood up. Security was already moving. The board voted to retain Victoria's leadership at an emergency session held the following morning. The vote was not close. Warren Cole was arrested before the end of the business day on a set of charges that the district attorney's office had clearly been preparing for some time, which suggested that Edward Hale's documents had not only been sent to Victoria. The stock recovered over the next 2 weeks with the kind of velocity that follows clarity markets. Like people, respond well to knowing what they are actually dealing with. The communications team sent a carefully worded statement. The board chair gave an interview in which she used the phrase institutional accountability 7 times. Several senior staff members who had kept their heads down for years sent Victoria messages through internal channels that said, in various careful phrasings, that they had been waiting for someone to say what she had said and that they were glad it had been said. Victoria answered each one with a brief acknowledgement and did not let herself feel too much about any of it, because the habit of not feeling too much was deeply ingrained, and dismantling it was a longer project than a single press conference. Victoria did none of these public things herself. She went to Daniel's apartment and sat on the kitchen floor with Lily and helped her finish a drawing of a house with a very large yard and a dog, which Lily informed her was not a real dog, but a dream dog, and that she was planning to name it Mr. Business. And Victoria said she thought that was an excellent name for a dog, and she meant it. She announced her resignation 3 weeks later. She did it cleanly and without drama, in a brief written statement that cited a desire to pursue work more directly connected to the communities her family's company had, historically, failed to serve. The board accepted it with the formal regret of people who are privately not entirely unhappy to absorb the publicity costs of her departure. The communications team issued a warm farewell statement. Several board members sent flowers. One sent a card with a handwritten note that read, "Your father would be proud." Victoria read that line 3 times and felt, for the first time, that it might be true not because of anything she had built or defended or won, but because of what she had been willing to dismantle. She did not read the broader coverage of the resignation. She was, at the time, sitting across from Daniel at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the draft of a nonprofit charter for something she had tentatively titled the Brooks Hale Foundation, a name he had refused twice and she had reinstated twice, and they were currently at a standstill. They had been working on the charter for 3 evenings, spreading pages across the kitchen table, while Lily drew at the other end and periodically made suggestions about the foundation's name that were increasingly creative and decreasingly usable. Lily walked through the kitchen, looked at them both, and said, with the authority of an 8-year-old who considers herself an expert on the topic, "You're both being dumb." Then she continued to her room. Daniel and Victoria looked at each other across the table and said nothing for a moment, and then Victoria said, "She's not wrong." And Daniel said, "She usually isn't." He had been pulling away for weeks in the small, careful way of someone who does not want to be seen doing it. More space in conversation. More practical. Less personal. He helped with logistics for the foundation, without volunteering anything beyond logistics. He answered her calls but didn't make them. Victoria noticed all of this and catalogued it, and told herself it was sensible that the distance between their circumstances was real and not romantic or sentimental, and that she had no standing to want things from a man she had arrived to dispossess 2 months earlier. She told herself this on a Tuesday and again on a Thursday, and with gradually decreasing conviction on the following Monday. And on that Monday, she also booked a flight. She had been offered a fellowship in another city, through a network connected to one of her board contacts. It was legitimate and well-funded, and a reasonable next step for someone doing what she said she was going to do. She packed a bag with the efficiency of someone who has moved through the world for a long time without accumulating too many attachments. She did not tell Daniel she was leaving. She told Lily, because Lily had earned the truth, and because Lily would make her feel the cost of it in a way that no adult would. Lily listened to her explain everything with the expressionless gravity of a child processing information she does not intend to accept. Then she said, "Did you tell Dad?" Victoria said, "No." Lily said, "Then you should." Victoria said she would send a message. Lily said, "That's the same as not telling him." She was in the car on the way to the station when she got his call. She almost didn't answer. She answered. He said, "Lily told me." She said, "I was going to message you." He said, "Yeah, she mentioned that too." The car moved through traffic. Victoria looked out the window at the city she had lived in her whole life and counted the blocks passing the familiar crossings, the corner where she had once stopped to buy coffee in the years when she was building something and believed she knew exactly what she was building. The city looked the same. She did not look the same, and the difference was the kind that cannot be undone. He said, "You don't have to go." She said, "I think I do." He said, "Tell me why." And she said, because she had been thinking about it for days, and she had earned the right to be honest about it, at least to herself, "Because I don't know how to be in your world without being the person who almost took it from you. And I think you deserve someone who doesn't come with that whole history." He was quiet for long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "I spent 10 years being quiet because someone paid me to. I'm not going to be quiet now about something that actually matters." She told the driver to stop. The car pulled to the curb between a dry cleaner and a newsstand, in a block she had driven through 100 times without ever looking at it. And she looked at it now, the ordinary, insufficient, irreplaceable texture of a city that had been going about its business through all of it. He told her to stay. She did not go to the station. She sat in the stopped car for a moment, and then she told the driver a different address, and the city moved past the windows in the direction of home. 1 year later, the center opened on a Saturday in late spring, in a building 3 blocks from Daniel's apartment, a building that had previously been a laundry facility and before that an informal food bank, and that the foundation had spent 7 months renovating with the help of contractors who donated time and materials and neighbors who showed up on weekends with sandwiches and strong opinions about where the windows should go. The center provided job training, child care assistance, legal resources, and a small library with an enormous collection of children's books that Lily had personally curated with the seriousness of someone who considers her reading opinions to be professionally grade. The morning of the opening, Daniel stood in the main room before anyone else arrived and looked at what had been built: the clean walls, the new flooring, the windows that let in the full measure of a spring morning, and thought about the 10 years between the accident and now, and whether there was a version of the story in which things had gone differently, and decided that there wasn't. That some things have to go the way they go in order to arrive where they arrive. And that arrival is not always a destination you could have drawn on a map from the starting point. But it is still, recognizably, a place you were always trying to reach. The opening was attended by a number of people who had never been inside a building like this one, and a larger number of people who had. Speeches were made. Lily helped cut the ribbon, and then immediately went to find the children's section and sit down, because she had, she said, been standing around at boring adult events for way too long. Victoria stood on the steps outside afterward, in the late afternoon light, in clothes that were neither the tailored, corporate black of the woman who had knocked on a stranger's door in the rain, nor entirely unlike her, simply herself, in the specific way that takes time to arrive at. Daniel came and stood next to her. They did not say anything for a while. The neighborhood moved around them, kids on bikes, someone grilling something 2 doors down. The same worn buildings that had been there forever. Looking, in the particular quality of that light, almost golden, he had a folded piece of paper in his hand. Victoria looked at it. He said, "Your father left one more letter. It was in the files, addressed to you." She took it. It was short. Her father had written, "There is a debt I owe you, Victoria, that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with the years I spent teaching you to lead a company instead of teaching you to know your own heart. I hope you find your way to it. I believe you will. The biggest debt a person carries is not the one in the ledger. It is the love they have not yet found the courage to give." Victoria folded the letter carefully. She held it. The afternoon light moved. Lily came back out and inserted herself between the 2 adults and took one hand from each of them and looked up at both of them with the satisfaction of someone whose plan has gone exactly the way she intended and said nothing at all, because some things don't need to be said out loud to be completely understood by everyone in the room. The debt, in the end, was never the money. It had never been the money. It had been the story beneath the money, the version of the truth that neither pride nor grief nor the long, careful machinery of corporate self-protection had been able to bury permanently, because it had been kept alive in the most unlikely of places, in a small apartment in a building with peeling paint and a broken buzzer, by a man who had taken a check he didn't want and raised a daughter who understood instinctively that the people worth holding on to are the ones who show up, and that the best things in any life are not the things that cost the most money but the things that cost the most of yourself. Victoria Hale had arrived at that door in the rain carrying a document and a decade of misdirected anger. She had left with the beginning of something she did not have a word for yet. A year later, she had the word. She had several words. She used them, quietly and without performance, in the ordinary and irreplaceable moments of a life she had not planned and could not have designed and would not have traded for anything in her father's ledger or her own. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes from giving up the life you thought you were supposed to be living, not because it was bad, but because it was always a map of someone else's territory. Victoria had been living from someone else's map for as long as she could remember. Her father's ambitions, the company's expectations, The world's idea of what a woman like her was supposed to want and protect and become, and she had been good at it. She had been exceptional at it. But exceptional and alive are not always the same thing. And she had discovered the difference on a rainy night, in a hallway that smelled of mildew, when an 8-year-old in pajamas held up a photograph and reminded her that she had once known how to make paper boats. The rain came again that November, the way it always does, heavy and indifferent, and somehow, on the right night, in the right company, exactly what the world needed.